And we are continuing to follow breaking developments out of Paris, where today's attack on a French satirical newspaper left at least 12 people dead. And it takes place in a larger context of tension between secular France and its large Muslim population, most visibly in the form of the burqa ban, which was upheld by a human rights court in July and produced years of protest since it was passed more than 4 years ago. Today, the French Muslim Council issued a statement on the Paris attack, saying this extremely grave, barbaric action is also an attack against democracy and the freedom of the press. America's own Council on American Islamic Relations had this to say: "We strongly condemn this brutal and cowardly attack and reiterate our repudiation of any such assault on freedom of speech, even speech that mocks faith and religious figures." Ibrahim Cooper is the National Communications Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And Ibrahim, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So when something like this happens, there are a couple of different aspects of it that we wind up discussing. One of them is the alienation of immigrants, sometimes first generation or even second generation immigrants, many of whom from Muslim countries in Europe, particularly in France. And the second, of course, is the question of religion and whether or not religious depictions trigger this kind of maximalist response. Yeah. How do you respond to those two aspects of this situation?
Well, it is true that Muslims in Europe often feel alienated, but no sense of alienation could justify this kind of brutal terror attack. I mean, we have defended people who have insulted Islam. For instance, Michael Savage, the radio host, was banned from Britain a number of years ago. And we said, no, you can't do that. You can't ban people just based on their speech. So we are some of the first defenders of First Amendment rights, free speech rights. And, that's something that is there in the Muslim community. We respect these kinds of things, and nothing can justify what happened today in Paris.
Yeah, and clearly, and and one of sort of the ironies, Ibrahim, is that when things like this happen, the focus, I was just talking with Dean Obadella about this, goes on all Muslims, on the entire Islamic world, rather than on the individuals, which then does feed the sense of people feeling alienated within these cultures.
It creates this downward spiral of mistrust and hostility, and I'm trying to figure out a way how we can get out of this downward spiral where these kinds of extremists take a violent action, which leads to anti-Muslim hostility, which leads to alienation, which leads to all kinds of counterproductive domestic and foreign policies, and it just creates this downward spiral. And how do we get out of it? And I think that's why mainstream followers of all faiths need to get together and marginalize the Muslims, marginalizing the extremists on their side, and also people of other faiths marginalizing this growing Islamophobic movement in the West and now in Europe. You've seen tens of thousands of people marching against Islam in Europe, and that sends a very negative message. It creates this sense of alienation, and it adds to this downward spiral that we all somehow need to get out of.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ross Douthat, who writes about religion from the conservative point of view here in the U.S., did tweet that regarding the French and the far right, Muslims and Islam are viewed more favorably in France than in Germany or Spain, but the far right is also stronger in France and elsewhere. And we also, Ibrahim, have seen this this situation where, as a couple of our guests today have mentioned, there are actually more fighters streaming into ISIS and joining from Europe than from Muslim countries. 700 are estimated, The Economist estimates, coming from France, which is one of the highest numbers in Europe. So do you think that we are at a moment where we've got to tackle this, because extremism actually is now starting to be born more in Europe, in a sense, than even in the countries?
These people who are going to places like Syria and Iraq are even alienated from their own faith and their own community, because the vast majority of American Muslim organizations, and groups worldwide have rejected the extremist ideology of ISIS and rejected their brutality in dealing with not only other religious minorities, but as the previous guest said, Muslims themselves, who are the prime victims of their brutality. So the clear message is out there. I mean, I've been getting hate calls all morning since this happened. Why don't Muslims speak out? That's the kind of thing we get every time something like this happens. We do speak out. We speak out consistently, repeatedly, but somehow the message isn't getting through.
Yeah, and pretty clearly groups like ISIS don't exactly listen to imams, don't exactly listen to what fellow Muslims have to say, or they wouldn't do what they were doing.
Believe me, we would be the first ones under their knife if they got a hold of us.
Yeah, indeed. Ibrahim Hooper, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.